My name is Seth Jacobowitz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures. It's my great pleasure today to introduce our invited speaker, Professor Sabine Frühstück. She's a professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies at University of California at Santa Barbara. Many of us know Professor Frühstück from her earliest work on sexology. Her first book came out in 2003, entitled Colonizing Sex, Sexology, and Social Control in Modern Japan. She's also the author of Uneasy Warriors, Gender, Memory, and Popular Culture in the Japanese Army, which came out in 2007. And most recently, Professor Frühstück was also the editor and contributor to the book Playing War, Children and the Paradoxes of Modern Militarism in Japan, which came out in 2017. And I know many of the other contributors, and it's just a really fascinating study. So I'd like to kind of get right into the talk so we can give her the opportunity to give the presentation. I have plenty of time for comments. Without further ado, Professor Sabine Frühstück.
Thank you so much, Seth, for this kind introduction. Thank you also to the Council for inviting me and for having me here. I haven't been here for quite a while, and I'm happy to see you all, even though I know this is a terribly busy time of the year for everybody. And I would like to just make one small correction, not substantial, but Playing War is actually a monograph. It's a monograph that came out in the same year as Child's Play that I co-edited that Seth meant to mention. No, I just wanted to make sure. I did realize that it was sort of not ideal to have two different things come out at the same time. In any case, in 1951, General Douglas MacArthur testified before the United States Senate that he supported the protection of the emperor system on the basis that the Japanese were in a very tuitionary condition. Measured by the standards of modern civilization, they would be like a boy of 12, susceptible to following new models, new ideas. Indeed, Imperial Japan's official rhetoric had been ripe with references to markers of age, including those of the generations and maturity. And even most recently, in the early 2000s, the Financial Times, in relation to Japan's self-defense forces deployment to Iraq, questioned Japan's status as a grown-up nation. And yet, despite such prevalent references to Japan's would-be infantility, we have ascribed low status to the study of children and childhood. According to historical data provided by the Statistics Bureau within the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, children defined here as individuals up to the age of 14 comprised 34% of the total population in 1888 and 36% in 1940. And yet, we have at least tacitly assumed that the fleeting status of childhood, the child's liminal identity, justifies ignoring children as historically relevant altogether. For better or worse, children grow up. And yet, to the Japanese imperialist state, children, or rather very specific notions of the child and of childhood, were immensely useful. It is this use value of children that I examine in my talk today in order to shed light on the cultures of emotion that were mobilized and shaped during the Japanese Empire. Japan's modern nation-state building came late and rapidly in the second half of the 19th century. During this time, the feudal warrior class gave way to a conscription-based mass army. Mandatory elementary schooling was introduced for boys and girls, and eventually the modern Meiji Constitution was promulgated in 1890. Japan's emergence as a formidable military power in Asia came to rest on victorious wars against China and Russia. Subsequently, Japan pursued both what Jennifer Robertson has called anti-colonial colonialism and the building of an empire that was eventually articulated as Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and that in time included large parts of Asia. Amidst this nation and empire building, references to adults often evoke the language and iconography of difference, often difference in terms of maturity, both when casting Japan as junior to Westerners, not only in physique, but also in the maturity of its civilization, and conversely, when casting Japan as senior, as older brother, or even father figure to other Asians. Children and the concept of childhood, by contrast, were assigned the role of erasing distinctions, the boundaries between Japanese colonizers and colonized Asians, and the exact conditions under which children encountered soldiers, whether in times of war, occupation, or peace. During the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the Japanese political and educational elites facilitated the complex historical work of constructing childhood. Yet, which children had a childhood and what kind of childhood is never self-evident data, but socially constructed in the struggle between the young and the old. In Japan, the mandatory elementary school system introduced in 1872 reconfigured childhood and divisions of the child population into age groups by prescribing first 5 and then 6 years of basic education for children from the age of 6. That same year, the conscription system deemed that male adulthood began at the age of 20, at which time all males took the military physical exam. Note that guidelines regarding when girls reached adulthood were not similarly fixed. Such remained a designation tied to marriage and motherhood. The Fundamental Code of Education, as well as subsequent legislation in the area of education, welfare, and crime, worked to gradually replace class status with age group or grade level as a primary social marker during childhood. These institutional changes emerged from and reinforced social changes and triggered a number of public debates about childhood, about the links between the health and welfare of children and the power of the nation, and about the possible benefits to children of children's rights. Informed by these debates, legislation also increasingly codified children's vulnerability, innocence, and need of protection, sometimes even from their own parents. The publishing and entertainment industry's tactics involved the marking and erasing of race and gender from representations of children so as to symbolically contain and enhance children's symbolic use value in the multi-layered and inherently contradictory imperialist project. Starting in 1931, when publishing and entertainment specialists volunteered in cooperating with army propagandists helping to mobilize the nation behind the military occupation of Northeast China, children made a powerful appearance in a range of visual and textual genre. They were featured in illustrations and increasingly photographs devoted to representing and commenting on the war and the armed forces. Such images were printed in, among other media, educational guides, children's books and magazines, newspapers, soldiers' memoirs, Childhood became a matter of imagining and of imaging to an unprecedented degree. Politically multivalent child-centered images constituted a cultural strategy that exploited what I will call their emotional capital, a concept akin to Pierre Bourdieu's triad of economic, social, and cultural capital. The emotional capital comprised both distinctly modern understandings of the emotional makeup of the child and calculations of adults' responses to children and representations of children and childhood. Rather than exploring emotions in terms of inner and individual phenomena, I'm interested in emotions as collective cultural experiences that potentially erode dichotomies such as inside, outside, individual, collective, and public, private. But how does one study the appropriation of emotions? Much as we would approach historical inquiry, by reading between the lines, looking for context, repetitions, contradictions, points of agreement, and discord. By examining the particular and the group, large trends, and individual examples in a range of textual and visual formats. Based on such broad analysis, my term emotional capital aims to capture both the oft-repeated notion that children were politically innocent, morally pure, and endowed with authentic feelings, as well as the expectations that adults would respond to representations of children with a predictable set of emotions. Indeed, an underlying question in this analysis is just what emotions were offered to the adults who not only read, explained, and contemplated children's books, magazines, and games, but who also viewed the child they were reading to against the prescriptive textual and visual templates. Indeed, for most of these materials, the historical reader is best understood not as an individual, passive recipient of various forms of indoctrination and socialization, but as absorbed and enthusiastically reading, exploring her imagination, participating perhaps with other children or adults in the production of the text's meaning, and exercising various degrees of autonomy across age cohorts and generations, levels of literacy, and to some degree, even class. Of these expected adult responses, one was essential: the insistence that children need protection. One prevalent debate concerning the nature of children, one prevalent debate concerned the nature of children. One camp believed that children are inherently wild and unpredictable and thus needed to be trained and controlled. The other conceptualized the child as humanity at its best, at its most natural and innocent. This camp authenticated children's emotions as inherently sincere and coming from within. Reflecting these tensions, child-rearing guides attempted to straddle both camps by encouraging mothers to carefully monitor and channel their children's potentially evil instincts and turbulent passions until they evolved into mature, well-adjusted people. Leave nothing to chance, they insisted, least of all the training of children's emotions. Indeed, children's emotions were expected to be internal and natural, and yet also to adhere to universal aesthetic standards of expression. Guides for the writing of comfort letters, for instance, did not just expect young letter writers to express appropriate emotions. It was assumed that they genuinely felt those emotions. For instance, a slim guidebook from 1940 specified that letters be written, quote, with a heart full of deep emotion and gratitude. Since soldiers on the battlefield were far from home and starved, quote, true human emotions. This advice further highlighted the aforementioned paradox of the appeal. Though the children's sentiments must come from deep within, must be true and sincere, they also had to be carefully crafted in order to establish the desired emotional bond between children writers and adult combatants and readers. Cultural producers held contradictory notions of just how emotions worked. On the one hand, they assumed that children's emotions were individual, inner, and true phenomena, uncorrupted by the adult world, or at least not yet corrupted. On the other, they recognized the utility of seeing children's emotions as collective cultural and historical experiences that were, thus, open to education and training, as well as to manipulation and indoctrination. This talk then examines how emotions associated with children in childhood functioned as social practices under the particular conditions of the Asia-Pacific War. I argue that children's emotional capital relied on the assumption of shared, readily available feelings that might have strengthened a sense of community, as in Barbara Rosenwein's emotional communities. More importantly for my analysis, however, it furthered a sense of an imperial unity of children against the backdrop of adults and adulthoods at war, as well as of a universality of childhood both across the empire and across the porous and vulnerable divide between war, occupation, and peace. These cultural producers appropriated children's presumed innocence, vulnerability, and purity so as to lend moral authority to war, legitimize empire, and ultimately naturalize those same children as future engineers of peace. As such, the legitimacy of Japan's militarism and imperialism came to symbolically depend on the empire's children, as well as on the qualities and capabilities assigned to them. In October 1938, the elegant Osaka-based lifestyle photo magazine Homu Raifu, Home Life, published 3 photographs by a minor photographer named Yamagami Entaro. They appeared in a rubric titled Children's Military Fashion. The first is of a sitting baby. It wears an oversized uniform cap and embraces an enormous pumpkin between its legs. In the second, a bare-chested boy, perhaps 8 years old, wears a military helmet and blows a bugle. In the third photograph, a boy wearing a military helmet holds a wooden rifle that sports a Japanese flag reading "Soldier's House." The caption for the 3 photographs describes the boys as commanders of our house. In all 3 photographs, the child looks playfully into the camera, laughing. These photographs mirror numerous visual and narrative representations of children appropriated, indeed commandeered, for a particular cultural complex, one that used emotions and the innate concepts of childhood in order to legitimize Japan's war-making and empire building. The swift multiplication of photographic depictions of children in militarist settings had been prompted by 2 cultural shifts. First, family photography became a widespread hobby among the urban middle class. It also became popular for families to commission portraits of their children dressed in military garb in stylized war settings. Such portraits made for curious tableaux. Boys, and sometimes girls, wielding toy rifles or bayonets, stern-faced, at attention, whether at home or concentrating on rifle practice in schoolyards. This is actually a kindergarten yard. Note that such a hobby called for considerable expense. Child-sized military uniforms, tank-like strollers, toy guns, such playthings were out of reach for the vast majority of the population. But families of lesser means partook as well, albeit with a stick for a rifle and a homemade flag. Though some of the portrayed children appear intensely uncomfortable, many others are smiling and laughing. Altogether, these portraits augur a natural, playful, and nonetheless inevitable transformation. The world of children will in time give way to the world of war, an eventuality that parents and other photographers readily promoted. As for the second cultural shift, during the same period, military photography increasingly complemented its stock repertoire large troop formations, groups of commanders, and occasionally Emperor Hirohito on his white horse, with human interest shots. Informed by this era's penchant for social realism in photography, notably to express the emotions of people's lives, these human interest images frequently feature children with soldiers, whether in Japan, in the colonies, or even behind the front lines. For instance, less than 3 months after the Nanking Massacre, the March 2nd, 1938 issue of the photo magazine Asahi Graph, the pioneer of graphic magazines, featured a series of photographs from the Chinese front. In line with contemporaneous military photography, many of the images portray occupying troops going about ordinary activities such as setting up tents, cleaning their equipment, or taking their surroundings. But one photograph, a close-up, depicts a smiling, very young-looking Japanese soldier posing with 2 Chinese girls, just as an older brother might pose with his sisters for a family album. The smaller girl is even sitting on the young man's lap. The caption states that upon the Japanese soldiers' arrival, these, quote, picture-perfect, lovely bobbed-haired girls cheerfully called out in Japanese, "Long live the Japanese army," end of quote. The adorability of the Chinese children serves to sideline, if not make invisible, the extreme violence that the Japanese army, this young man included, had just perpetrated on their community. The girl's gender further underlines their vulnerability, as well as the soldier's role as surrogate older brother and protector. For this maneuver to be effective, illustrators and writers of a wide range of publications needed to exaggerate some distinctions and erase others. 1, distinctions between soldiers hailed as fearless combatants at fighting enemies across Asia, and soldiers as momentary surrogate brothers or even mothers to children in occupied areas. 2, distinctions between heteronormative formations of boys and girls and the pronounced desexualized representations of prepubescent children. 3, distinctions between Japanese and other Asian children within and beyond the boundaries of empire. And 4, distinctions between the relentless mass violence of the present and the peace and harmony that the prepubescent child, by virtue of its innocence, would bring to the future. The first objective, blurring the incongruity of the soldier hailed at home as a fearless combatant while also acting as surrogate protector to children in occupied areas, was effected by the dissemination via various media of images of children having curious and friendly encounters with soldiers. These encounters constituted an emotional formation, images and narratives of children with soldiers that are relentlessly reproduced in order to reinforce the relationship of one to the other. Postcards with such motifs were given away or cheaply sold. Children's picture books and magazines included these manipulations in both illustrations and advertisements. One ad in particular vividly depicts this incongruity. An Imperial Army soldier offers a Chinese child a caramel. This is this part of the picture. In the background, a Japanese mother in an apron that indicates her middle-class affiliation gives the same brand of caramel to her Japanese children. The text reads, "The clock turns 3. The Chinese child received 1 Meiji caramel. Haven't you also received Meiji caramels from your mother at about this time? Meiji caramels." End of quote. Thus, text and drawing liken both the soldier at the front to the mother at the home front and Japanese children to Chinese children, and thus to a universality of children. When the November 1933 issue of the leading boys magazine Boys Club features a naturally gifted boy named Ichiro drawing Dankichi and his black mouse friend Sir Kari alongside Norakuro under the admiring eyes of his friends, the text suggests that the three comic protagonists, a hapless soldier dog, Norakuro, a clueless boy king of cannibals, Dankichi, and his generally far wiser mouse, Sir Kari, had actually come to visit and ostensibly play with him, a fantasy of many a young boy reader at the time, the fantasy, namely, of bringing the empire home in the shape of the comical embodiments of child soldiers. The longing for intimate connections and playful interactions of Ichiro with these fictional soldiers is reconfigured many times across a range of publications, typically designed for children. One such drawing in a children's book evoked an over-the-top idyllic scene of IJA soldiers with children of occupied territories. Text alongside the illustration explained that the soldiers were about to read to the native children the comfort letters they had just received from Japanese children. The light-skinned Japanese soldiers lounge under palm trees, leisurely conversing with brown-skinned children. One of them casually tickles a child's head. Two soldiers read the letters out loud, just like they might read to their own children back in Japan. As for the comparison of children from different countries, when Japanese children were depicted intermingling with children under Japanese colonial control, most often Korean or Manchurian, the Japanese children were distinguished from the others only by their clothing or perhaps the presence of the hinomaru. Yet another variation involved cross-species depictions, with fairy tale boys such as Peach Boy, Momotaro, and a range of critters, including mice. In one 1936 issue of Yonen Kurabu, Children's Club, for instance, a certain Noguchi Ujo describes how a mouse commander leads an advancing army game at the occasion of New Year's. His army of mice, dressed as girls and boys, march in one line, hinomaru flags in paw, while making a train's onomatopoetic hissing sounds. Even more ambivalent and ambiguous were depictions of Japanese and German children, published in both children's and adult publications. These formations appeared in part as the result of the significant changes in political attitudes in the years leading up to and beyond the Tripartite Pact of 1940. For instance, in as early as 1935, Hitler stated that, quote, the SS would have to become the German samurai, albeit within the Nazi ideology of the Germans being superior to the Japanese. And yet, in 1942, a security service report described the German population's attitude towards the Japanese as being consumed by an inferiority complex, likely from the feats of the, quote, death-defying Japanese and the magnitude of their deliberate and conscious sacrifice. All the same, Japanese newspapers and magazines embraced the notion of children's universality and unity, extending it to children of the Third Reich across different publications and readership generations. At least one picture book, here the Kodansha picture book on Hitler, Kodansha no Ehon Hitra, claimed that Hitler loved children and that Germany and Japan were good friends. The book had likely been inspired by a series of exchanges and mutual visits by journalists, politicians, and representatives of mass organizations of athletes and Hitler Youth. The ostensibly friendly relationship between the two nations was succinctly depicted in a drawing of two nearly identical boys shaking hands. They're the same height, and they both wore knee-length black shorts. That the image is in black and white furthers the racial ambiguity of their facial features. They are differentiated only by their clothes, a German Hitler Youth uniform and a Japanese boys' school uniform. In this evocative illustration, these two boys signaled equality, similarity, unity, and the universality of childhood, all while engaged in the distinctly non-childish gesture of a handshake. But though Hitler was frequently photographed with children and youth for propaganda purposes, by no means was his a call to elevate childhood, to gild it with innocence, empathy, and moral purity. His often proclaimed love of children strove to eradicate childhood by conceptualizing boys and girls as eager to join the Hitler Youth and the German League of the League of German Girls, youth organizations that offered a tantalizing whiff of adulthood. Indeed, Hitler had been one of the first 20th century leaders to unmistakably articulate quite a different use value of children in the aggressive fusion of childhood and war. Not long after World War I, when many teachers and military commanders still frowned upon boys' early introduction to military training, Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf of the tactical objective to win over the child. He was convinced that anybody who knew anything about the juvenile spirit would know that youth always lend a glad ear to rallying cries about what it meant to be German for boys and becoming a German mother for girls. Back in Japan, soldiers' memoirs for child readers also conveyed a now familiar mimetic repertoire of sentiments, reiterating the lovability of children on both sides of the front line and the special bond between these children and the conquering soldiers. In one such memoir, Soldiers and Children, Heitai to Kodomo, from 1942, Muneta Hiroshi wrote touchingly about the children he had met as a member of the Imperial Japanese Army. Appealing to the empathy of his Japanese readers, he related how some of those children had lost their fathers or mothers or both. He noted that their world had been turned upside down, their schools burned, their houses gone. He recalls that he and his fellow soldiers got along with them really well, played with them, gave them sweets, and made them laugh. The fact that he identified how the food and sweets had come from their comfort bags further ingrained a direct connection of similarity, friendship, or shared responsibility between Japanese children and those of the empire. After all, the children back home had helped pack those bags. By the same token, the good nature of the Japanese soldiers, along with their dignity and righteousness, is amplified via their encounters not just with children themselves, but also with their possessions. Hino Ashihei, famous writer of war literature, reports in Flower and Soldiers, Hana to Heitai, 1939, how a ranking officer urges the respect of children and their world. Quote, "Do not touch children's belongings at all. If there are any in the house, we'll move into. Though we settle there, this is just a temporary borrowing of the houses of the residents that is due to unavoidable necessity. We are by no means appropriating these houses permanently, and when their owners come back, we'll have to return them. At that time, if a family with a child should come back and the child does not find his shoes, socks, hat, or toys, how sad will he be?" End of quote. Importantly, The children described in these accounts were never referred to as enemies, since such would have undermined the premise of their needing protection. They stood outside the political realm. They were first and foremost innocent and vulnerable children. Regardless of the medium, depictions of children were almost always specifically anchored in the notion, indeed the emotion, of children as sweet, vulnerable, and trusting creatures primed to incite empathy in all viewers and readers. These assigned characteristics become visible, indeed imaginable, because the children in these scenes cannot speak for themselves. The Japanese soldiers in these scenes always encounter such children alone, without protection. For the child to become visible in the historical record of war, their families must be seen to have failed to protect them, even if their failing was in being killed. This is because the intended effect of these portrayals, the imagining of an emotional bond between children and soldiers, requires that the children's families be literally and figuratively out of the picture. By this means, the conquerors can be seen as surrogate family and protectors, absolved of any guilt or shame of their conquest. The portrayals also impose the notion of childhood as universally innocent, and of children as already always worthy of empathy of soldiers and readers alike. At the same time, the fact that the scenes help to normalize encounters between children and soldiers also distracted the focus from and served to reduce the violence that preceded such seemingly innocent relationships. They helped to convey the notion that the soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army were good men who intended only to protect and rescue all children. These images and narratives transmuted war into an aesthetic and rhetoric, not of destruction, but rescue, not of battle, but peace, not of chaos, but comforting order. When soldiers were portrayed as figuratively touching children, as embracing their childlike innocence, their gestures established that they could connect with their own childhood, or at least that they longed to. The forcefully, repeatedly conveyed notion of the universality of childhood facilitated the notion that children were already symbolically united and were thus the natural builders of peace. The Japanese wartime cultural machinations tying children to the war effort were not unique, of course. Similar mechanisms were employed in war and occupation settings around the world. Nor did 1945 constitute a total rupture in the cultivation of the emotions I've described. The new Constitution in 1946 formed the basis of what later became, until only recently, an institutionalized and normalized anti-militarism. Both occupation-era photography and soldiers' reflections quickly reconstituted the emotional capital of children. Rather than being enlisted in emotionalizing and legitimizing empire, children were now more than ever enlisted as embodiment of peace and icons of humanitarianism. Lisa Mulkey has observed constructions of the human in contemporary humanitarianism, that constructions of the human in contemporary humanitarianism center on special, observably standardized representational uses of children in registers with effective, affective and ritual efficacy. Yet, as we've seen, these representational uses of children are not an invention of the effects of war, but are part of the very fabric of justifying war. As occupation-era depictions of children and soldiers assigned Japanese children to roles that had previously been held by Asian children in areas once occupied by the Japanese Imperial Army, the Japanese publishers, editors, writers, illustrators, and advertisers who had helped militarize the realm of the child made a perplexingly swift turn. They fervently promoted how to turn children into pacifists. Indeed, back into what now were claimed to be true children, necessarily oblivious to the woes of post-war occupation. As phrased by a girl who had served in the Himeyuri Girls' Corps, a unit of female students mobilized to the front in the Battle of Okinawa, quote, "Finally, I was able to rid myself of military clothes and be a girl again," end of quote. The girl she wanted to return to was, of course, both female, no longer wearing male soldiers' clothing, and a child restored to innocence. In this post-war phase, two things occur. Actual children become victims, and children in children's books become pacifists. American chocolate and chewing gum become as welcome as pacifist instruction, including familiarity and sympathy towards their former enemy, especially the United States. One example is the 1946 English conversation picture book, Come, Come, English for Everybody. On its cover, a tall, blonde American GI bends down to a Japanese boy in a school uniform. On the pages within, the boy talks to the American about Japanese sights and society. Throughout, illustrations and narrative signal the new world order manifested in the shape of an irreversible, generational reconfiguration. Another picture book published by Kodansha, America Meguri, from 1948, returns to the universality of childhood. The book introduces American sights from coast to coast and features everyday scenes from grocery shopping to doing laundry, all described as if a tourist guide for children. The preface by Isobe Yuichiro, the director of the Public Relations Division of Tokyo newspaper, emphasized the importance of today's children understanding the real America. And while the cover is similar to earlier wartime Kodansha picture books, which often included both a girl and a boy, from Japan proper and the colonies, it also signals a new political, racial, and gender order. While the boy's facial features are ambiguous, the boy's dark hair suggests he could be Japanese. And while the girl's strawberry blonde hair leaves no doubt that she's American, she also holds a Japanese doll in her arm. Japan, the big brother or even father to Asians in the empire, has turned into the younger brother of Miss America, whose right arm rests on the boy's shoulder, further emphasizing Japan's and the boy's junior status in this new relationship and world. In a crowning touch, the American flag flutters in the background. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, not only in terms of your analysis, but these images are, each one is a kind of gem unto itself. Maybe we can open the floor to questions. We have a pretty full room, so Caitlin first, and we'll go around the room.
Yeah, thank you for that great talk. It was fascinating. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, so a lot of this seems to fit in nicely and yet also somewhat clash with ideas about, in Japanese colonial discourse, about the construction of race in the colonies, of the idea of the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Chinese as little brother ethnicities, I'm sensing that that seems to fit in with these depictions of children as sort of the same as Japanese, but there's also something about the discourse that maintains the difference, that is, they're always going to be little brothers. They're never going to grow up into older brothers, which you can't. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
I look at the materials that I've presented and described as one variation on the kind of theme you've just articulated. The point I was trying to make, and I think that holds throughout the first half of the 20th century, is that it really depends on who the intended audience of these materials is and how these materials circulate. In contrast to materials that were produced for a teenage audience, for instance, and for an adult audience. The one image I showed where Japan is this huge figure and other Asians in the greater East Asian co-prosperity spheres are simply smaller figures. One can't even see them as necessarily younger in terms of generation, but smaller figures in ambiguous ways. These are more interested in the, these representations are more interested to go back and forth between leveling difference and emphasizing difference. For the children I'm interested in, and it's important, I think, to not conflate children with teenagers here, because these are materials for children that are largely written in katakana, so for either a very beginner reader or a non-reader. And so for these children in particular, the emphasis is on we are all children. We have a shared set of characteristics. And these children are already always at peace. They are already protected. They are the future peace builders. So there's much less in this material than in the material for the next older age group about, yes, and the next thing that will happen is you will grow into a fierce Japanese soldier. It places these younger children in a very particular way and also in a much more egalitarian place vis-a-vis other Asians. I should note, though, I'm sorry to go on, I should note, though, that of course we can't assume that readers actually read according to the age group these things were produced for. And so, of course, there's always a mix of, we can assume that adults read to the children or older children read to the children, but looking at the material itself, it is somewhat distinct from materials produced for other age groups.
We'll just work our way around. Yeah. If you could identify yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Young-sun, postdoc at CAS, and I really enjoyed your talk. And I was wondering, the children as ideological inscription, like you acknowledge it is a kind of universal one. So could you elaborate on Japanese uniqueness on this case particularly, and also you emphasized on the culture that emphasizes children's innocence and really pure quality, but do you also see the counterexamples such as children as unruly, dangerous, does require social engineering and control?
I'm primarily a student of Japanese culture, so it's very hard to make clear-cut statements about how the Japanese case compares to other places, but I have looked at similar materials during the occupation after the Second World War in Europe, for instance. And one of the things a number of things one can probably say with some certainty are the following. First of all, the kinds of images that I've shown here and the kinds of rhetoric I've presented can be found everywhere. So the difference does not lie necessarily in the exact shape and aesthetics of these representations, but I believe it lies in how prevalent these materials were. And so I use the example of Nazi Germany, where you can also find representations of Hitler and the SS leadership with little children in similar kinds of formations where the sort of vulnerability and the cuteness of the child is used to enhance the humanity of the adult. But it was much less common in the German context. Same with occupation era France, for instance. Mary Louise Roberts has found that there were also postcards of German soldiers with French children, for instance. There are very similar, comparable accounts of actual soldiers on all fronts, including, I have this very nice example from a Russian medic that marches into Berlin. And she's recalling all the horrors that the German Wehrmacht has perpetrated in her home. And then she says, and yet, looking at these at these German children, I couldn't help but give them the candy we had and things like that. So these things pop up in different contexts, but the one difference is how prevalent they are, and another difference, and I think Japan in that sense is certainly fully exploiting this potential. To what degrees do they exploit certain notions of the child and of childhood? And that's very different in Nazi Germany. I think there's a very, very pronounced emphasis on even little children, like those you've seen in these pictures of that age, are really just into getting away from that childhood and getting away from being vulnerable and not quite mature enough yet. That's a very common reoccurring image in the German context. By the same token, to say one last word, of course you can find images, propaganda posters with Stalin, with Mao, with little kids on their lab, for instance. But that's not very commonly circulating in these places to the degree I know. Hopefully somebody else will do a serious job, somebody who actually reads those languages. I've looked into it a little bit. Another difference in the Japan case is, of course, that you don't see the emperor with children. The emperor is not interested, for obvious reasons, as you all know, in appearing particularly human.
So, I think Fabian has his hand up first, and then Stephen, and then Sakura. So we'll no 8-part questions.
Just sorry, Seth, I'm not trying to overrule.
No, it's okay.
Just because it's super related, and maybe this doesn't justify kind of a longer comment, because I understand it's not a comparative project, but I do think it is really notable that these are visual motifs that are also connected to media and commodity forms of capitalist modernity. And so on the one hand, yes, to look at the particularities of the Japanese Empire, and I definitely understand the draw to, for instance, Nazi Germany as an ally, for instance. But I wonder to what degree these are visual motifs that are sticking to these commodity and media forms and could be said to be circulating globally, also France, Britain, United States, in a way that is really about those commodity and media cultures that are not necessarily specific to the Japanese case, for instance.
Yes, maybe?
Was a wonderfully stimulating talk and Q&A already at this point. I have a complex of questions. Let's see if it makes any sense. When listening to you, looking at the images, I was wondering what the intentionality of the artists is, what the processes are by which they get by their images. Do they copy from one another? Is there something in the air that they are bringing down on paper? Whom are they imagining as their audience? And it seemed quite diverse in the examples that you gave. Some things may have been more for an adult audience. other things seem to be children's images, but children's books, but I wondered whether even with the children's books, the artists imagine the adults looking over the shoulders of the children. One thing that did come to mind, but though probably reads too much into the evidence, is that humans react very strongly to the faces of children in particular, and I imagine that by the 1930s, this is much better understood than before. There's something disarming about seeing a child's face. It attracts our attention immediately. And it would be fascinating if you had materials that allow you to understand to what extent the artist was strategizing and to what extent they were just trying out lots of different things, or perhaps half subconsciously repeating themes that really worked. Now to broaden this scale of questions even further, I think your presentation raises the question, what is special about the mid-20th century? I was searching my memory for earlier images where children are deployed in the service of a war effort, and while there might be earlier examples, I think in that kind of density and consistency, at least to my mind, well, I drew a blank, and I don't know if that tells us something about the media environment, perhaps about the scale of materials being produced for children, or if there's something about the particular totalitarian wars of the mid-20th century where reaching for the child as an image reminds people that this is not just a matter of two monarchs having a property dispute, but that it's the peoples themselves that are more, I'm sorry, a very undisciplined question. Pick out anything that seemed to have...
You call that one question? Okay, I'll try what I can. First of all, in terms of the intentionality of the artist, I'm not equipped to answer that question. But what, as a product, as a whole, right, a children's book or a children's magazine, what that tells you, and this is easy to address, is that intentionality was very, very explicit. It's not something that, you know, just emerges from the images. Many of these children's books and magazines, books in particular, had something like a preface, a call to educators and mothers, often to sensei and to the teachers and the mothers. The fathers don't get singled out, precisely with the message that they envision a particular book or a particular story is supposed to convey. That said, of course, that doesn't exclude the possibility that different kinds of readers made different kinds of senses of all of this. And the reason why or one of the reasons why I'm so focused on the emotionality of the child is precisely because, of course, that's not necessarily a message, or not only a message to other children, right? As we know, right, children are not particularly invested in being vulnerable unless they want to get something out of you. Sorry, that was but so it's not the main driving sentiment of the child. But so some of these signals, I think, are really intended for an adult reader or a reader to the child. But again, on top of that, there were real directions on mothers and to mothers and teachers that essentially articulated that there's nothing more important than to teach our children certain kinds of things that they hopefully will find in the pages and in the pictures. The question about early 20th century specificity of the ubiquity of children's images, I think is a very good observation. And I think that has to do partly with the previous question, But quite simply, with the discovery of, first of all, with the development of media in general, right? There's an explosion of magazines, an explosion of children's books. The Japanese state discovers the thing that is called home front, that actually one needs to have at least passive support of anybody at home if one is to successfully conduct a long-term war. There are also, of course, artistic possibilities. But as you know, children's books and magazines were one of the last kinds of publications that still were published in color. And there was a reason for that, because of course the assumption was that children would be more attracted to color than to black and white kinds of illustrations. One other question that I'm unsure whether you asked it or I had it. I thought about that when you asked your question, was about, no, I think I forgot, sorry. People keep telling me it will come back later, but I don't know whether that's true. I'll try.
I see we have a few hands. Let's try to just squeeze in very short questions. So Sakura.
Mine already got answered by that comment, so.
Wow,
yes.
we're already making progress. So Bill and then Young.
Thank you, Sabine. Very insightful as always. And I was wondering if you could maybe reflect on two issues that I was thinking about in your presentation. They also go back to your 2017 book, and one is about Seinen youth and the other is about sports, because it seems that Seinen youth category developed over that same period as that passage between children and adults. So I'm wondering to what extent representations of Seinen, of youth, had the same kinds of sort of symbolic load and affective qualities as children vis-a-vis the war effort. And of course children are asobi, and sports, I mean, you've written yourself, I mean, appeared in that same period, particularly important for Seinen, for youth. And sports are different from asobi. And so sports then played sort of a role in imagining both these periods of life, but also their relationship to character formation and social contribution, political contribution.
You're asking me whether there's a similar set
First of all, how this category of youth, Seinen, relates to children, and whether they bore similar or different kinds of associations that you're talking about here, and whether, and this difference between asobi and sport, between play and sports, associated with those sort of two periods, and again, the use of them representatively in this kind of imagery.
Right. So for Seinen, I think the core set of images is quite different, because you see these older kids then, for instance, in war games, represented in war games, and there's much more emphasis on such war games not being play, not being mere play. There is a distinction between war games as just being fun and being sort of a nice pastime, and war games that are meant to actually train and educate young boys in particular to become soldiers. And you see this both in writings, of course, of teachers, for instance, but also of military instructors. Military instructors did go into schools to train boys in marching in formation, rifle practices, and so on and so forth, but also in representation. So for the younger children, for instance, you would have relatively wild formations of children being all over the place, preferably with a puppy, you know, a very cute little dog, playing with self-made kinds of toys and weapons, whereas for seinen and then older teenagers in general, the emphasis is very much on likening these boys and their games to the actual soldiers. So you would have Imperial Army soldiers with some fire or bomb-like illustration on the cover, and then all kinds of writings and images of boys. In terms of, I can't believe you're asking me about Sobi and sports, since that's your field of expertise. But in the work, in the writings and images of war games that I've looked at, sports doesn't come up at all. It's not the kind of sort of casual understanding I would normally have that some sports are sort of like military training, or our casual understanding that some sports take on some of the characteristics or do some of the socialization work that militaries might do in some other context. Sport is not part of that war game picture, partly because even in the few images that you saw of relatively young boys of marching in the school yard, for instance, it's military. The teachers are there, right? They are present, but it's military who makes them march. And there's no sense that this is fun for the children. At the same time, there are also maneuver-type war games of thousands of children orchestrated in the 1930s and 40s, often modeled in some fashion on Imperial Army maneuvers. And some children report that that was fun. But from the perspective of the instructors and the teachers, they had no interest in putting sports and these kinds of trainings in one field, so to speak.
Okay. Sabine has been a real trooper so far, but I think we'll have one more question. No one liked my pun.
I got it.
Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, and I think I particularly found your presentation of like the varied assemblages of children's use value to be fascinating, not just for the breadth and diversity of the values themselves, but I guess the differences that you've noted between the Japanese use cases and Germany and Hitler, for example. But in line with the use values that you've assigned, particularly in this talk, to young children, I did have a question. In your work thus far with this material, have you marked or noticed either shifts or phases within the primary uses of these, I guess, use values throughout, I guess, the total war mobilization towards the end of the war? I think you just touched upon it in your last answer a little bit, but the reason why I ask is particularly with your emphasis on the use of children's media along this development, magazines and books and whatnot. A particular media pops into my head, specifically within the media development of animation. You mentioned Momotaro before, but the 1945 release of Momotaro's Umi no Shinpei, which was specifically targeted at children, and comes completely, if not even further in line with the use value of children that you mentioned with Hitler, right? Children in that film are specifically targeted directly as soldiers, not just children. Their play is equated with jumping off a tree onto America, this idea of preparing for invasion. There's an interesting analog to education, but since we're out of time, I will leave that on the other side. But I was just wondering if you saw any major shifts or, I guess, primary phases of development throughout this type of use value scape.
I think the shift is not so much in terms of the timeline that you're looking at, than across different age groups. Momotaro, there's a reason why Momotaro comes in 1945. I mean, in terms of this timeline, right? You have comics before that, Norakuro, for instance, and if you wanted to, somebody did, if you wanted to do a study of how Norakuro appears over the 20 or so, 25 years it was published. There is, of course, a transformation of the character from something much more benign and clueless to somebody more focused and militaristic. But overall, in terms of the bulk of the material I've looked at, I don't think one can speak of a trend towards the moment of Momotaro.
Okay, I think we should once again thank Professor Frühstück for a fascinating talk.